started out as a teacher, and I worked with children with learning difficulties. And of course, the vast majority were children with reading problems. And I was working at a time when in North America, in Canada, there were tendencies to really use whole language methodologies. And I was fascinated by the difficulties of the pupils and of the fact that many of them just were not progressing. Their problems were very recalcitrant, and so I began to be interested in what's going wrong for these children that they can't quite make any progress. And we were using particular methods that really looked at the word level and not so much at the sublexical or below the word level. And I happened on a conference. I went as a teacher to a conference for special needs teachers, and I heard a talk by Lynette Bradley, who was a colleague at the time. They were a leading team in the UK working on early literacy. And she was talking about the cognitive component skills of early reading, and was talking about the importance of phonemic awareness training and optimal methods, and about the effectiveness of certain types of intervention. And it was a real revelation, because I saw that it was possible to help children with reading difficulties. They weren't going to stay poor readers forever, or at least they would improve to some extent, the good news. And that was the turning point for me. I think that conference, I just became very interested in learning about, learning about not just the cognition, but the whole developmental language and cognitive components that enable children to learn to read and write, and then how to either strengthen their weaknesses or work around them more effectively. And so with that, I decided to go back to university, and I took up some studies in educational psychology and completed a master's in that, and that basically started my my academic career. And then I went on to do a PhD, and the rest is history. Reading and writing are really psycholinguistic skills. They're skills that need to be acquired. They are based on the child's understanding and use of an artifactual system for mapping onto language. There's a whole learning element involved there. And so I think psychology, developmental psychology, of course, has a lot to tell us and to explain to us about development in all its aspects. But for literacy, the relationship between language and phonological, but not only phonological development, and the learning of another system, and mapping those two things together, I think is quite necessary. And I think psychology is the main domain where we investigate questions about this type of learning and development. So the basic research of psychological components of a behavior, and the breakdown of that behavior or the inability to acquire it, is one part. So the explanation may be based on some theoretical models and based on innovations in imaging from neuroscience and those aspects of the study, just what is the mind and the brain and the child and the learner doing, they give us one part of the story. Another part of the story is really already reaching out to education in this context of intervention studies. So one thing is to understand what you think is going wrong or might improve the development. Another thing is to test those hypotheses and the validity of those findings through intervention research. Well, intervention research almost always happens sort of hand in hand with education, with teachers, and with children in learning contexts, usually schools. So that's the sort of the validation process. And then the results of well-conducted intervention studies then should be informing the teaching field and should be reporting as to what works and what doesn't work, and be refining our understanding of how best to teach children to read and write. In the basic research component, let's say when we're talking about very early literacy, one of the things that we now understand, but it took some time, maybe several years, decades even, to agree in the field of reading research, that some crucial components for reading among beginners is an awareness of speech sounds in the language. So that's called phonemic awareness. The ability to think about sounds and manipulate them. So that's one, the language-based ability. Another one is the ability to learn the symbols that function in your orthography. So if you're learning an alphabetic orthography, it's the letters. Mm-hmm. Learning, of course, how those two things connect, which sounds go with which letters, and vice versa. And there's also a third component that we now know is very, very important, which is the ability to name visual objects rapidly. And we think that has something to do with the efficiency of that mapping system between visual and language, or you can say auditory, but the phonological and the visual. So we know that those are three very important skills through basic research, experiments, observational, and so on. So knowing that, the next stage is to conduct some intervention studies where we try to operationalize that. We try to find out what type of phonemic awareness training should we carry out to help the child most. How do we best teach children to learn the connections between words and sounds? We can also ask things like, well, can you train how quickly a child can name visual objects? So we can put all those kinds of questions together in intervention programs where we try different combinations of things. And we ask, well, which one works best? And once we do that, we carry out our intervention work and identify, at least within the realm of the possible, what works best. Then we should be informing the educational field and teachers and explaining and sharing the materials that we have found to work well, the approaches, the methods, and so on. I think that one of the very important aspects of the real life in the classroom that teachers bring to the whole research arena is a reflection of what's really possible in an actual classroom, in actual conditions of the teaching context. Very often, teachers at conferences where we talk about the effectiveness, say, of particular kinds of phonics interventions, oral language for reading comprehension, all of these lovely programs that we develop, you will then hear things like, yes, but in my classroom, we haven't got the resources, or the class is too big, or yes, but in order for a child in my context to be identified with difficulties, they have to be practically nonverbal because there aren't the let's say the financial resources to support children with milder difficulties. There are all kinds of realities that teachers bring to the discussion that are very, very important, I think, in informing how we can think about best practice and supporting the research, adapting our methods so that they can actually be carried out, not just in the ideal that we think is lovely in a lab. What comes back from the field, from educators, from teachers, can not only sort of crystallize our thinking about what's possible, but yes, maybe what's a higher priority in a particular classroom, in a particular context. Usually that's to do with the sort of socioeconomic, but not only, with really the population in question, and the expectations of the families, and the realities of, yes, the language that's spoken in the classroom versus in the home, and all of those kinds of factors, yeah. Speech sounds, phonemes, are not discrete units that a child can just easily imagine or identify, while letters are discrete symbols, written symbols. And the challenge is to connect those two bits of information to be able to decode, say, an alphabetic orthography. So what plenty of research has shown us is that it is absolutely possible to teach that through actually several methods. You don't necessarily, you can heighten a child's phonemic awareness of speech sounds through just oral language practice, various activities like rhyming and alliteration games, where you focus their attention on individual sounds that differentiate between words. So that's one possibility. And in some cultures, for example, I know in the Czech Republic and in Slovakia, that is still to this day a very big part of preschool education. But we know really that the shortcut, a very effective one, is to explicitly teach children, once they're ready to be learning the alphabet, to teach explicitly the correspondences between letters and sounds. And that in itself, of course, focuses the child's awareness of both of these symbol systems or representational systems, and facilitates, accelerates both their letter knowledge and their phonemic awareness. We do know quite a bit now. So looking at the aspects of learning that are most critical early on, which is these letter sound correspondences we were just talking about. The orthography has some influence on the extent to which children can learn those correspondences, to the extent that a language has consistent letter sound mappings. So languages that typically have one letter which corresponds to one sound and one sound which corresponds to one letter, in those kinds of systems, children just need to learn their alphabet and the sound values, and they're pretty much on their way. In languages where the orthography, it has a more inconsistent set of mappings, including Portuguese, including English, French. The fact that it's possible to pronounce a letter in multiple ways, or to spell a sound with multiple letters, that has a sort of slowing impact on learning. So it's the kind of cognitive cost to the learner, at least in the early years, to have to learn the multiple possibilities of mapping. I think excellent tuition is important in every language, of course. And maybe in countries and languages where the system is just more consistent for the beginner, the emphasis very early on might move on to other aspects of the literacy, the fluency. Often, there are trade-offs. You might have a consistent orthography, but the morphology might be diabolically difficult or, complex. So you might, it's not to say that it's easier to teach literacy in one language than another, but I do agree, yes, I think in languages where the basic code knowledge is more complex, of course, that should require more structured and systematic, probably for longer, yes, for sure. So they can, of course, shed light exactly on those components when you're comparing children, as long as you're using methods that allow direct comparison. You can begin to understand how much simple attainment levels can vary across languages. So you want to know whether learning, say, a more consistent, transparent, let's say, orthography, does that mean that children read more accurately earlier? Do they make the same kinds of mistakes? Maybe they're making fewer mistakes, but when they do make them, are they doing the same thing as children learning an inconsistent orthography? And those kinds of comparisons have shown us very interesting commonalities and differences. So on the one hand, it's kind of obvious that children who are learning a more consistent system tend to acquire it more quickly, and so they're attaining higher levels, let's say, of reading speed, reading accuracy, and so on. But at the same time, we know that what enables children, whether they're reading it at a lower level or a higher level, to crack that code, to understand how it works and to start becoming independent readers, those kind of cognitive underpinnings are very similar, certainly in alphabetic orthographies to the extent that they've been studied. And at the same time, we see, for example, that when children who have very variable or inconsistent systems to learn, when they make errors, they do tend to show quite different profiles of errors. So children who learn highly consistent orthographies tend not to make up other other answers. They don't guess. They do it to a much lesser extent. They might produce a non-word, an incorrect reading of the word, but they're much less likely to say either "I don't know" or to guess at what the word might be. The guessing factor is much lower than when children are learning a system that is inconsistent, and sort of the guessing or partial reading, partial decoding, and partial filling in what's plausible is almost a part of the strategy that they have to adopt. And if I can tell you another example from a recent study of spelling development that we've completed. So children from learning, let's say, Spanish versus children learning English, we've given them comparable words, in fact, cognate words, so that it's the same word essentially with a slightly different pronunciation. The error profiles for the English learners for those very same words are just massively different. So the variability in error types is in the order of tens of different variations of the correct spelling, as opposed to the Spanish incorrect profile, which might one or two there. Yes, it's a massive difference. And so these comparative studies, to the extent that you can compare like for like problems, really can reveal what's going on for the learner cognitively and strategically in how they are learning the system.